Good evening, my friends. It's Tuesday evening and time for our continuation of reading through the Bible. I'm Pastor Lou Kilgore. I'm here at the High Mountain Presbyterian Church in Franklin Lakes. It was a snowy day today for the first time in the northern area here of New Jersey, and it was kind of exciting. It was like a forced sabbatical, snow day. The school that we sponsor was off. And so it was a good day to read some stuff. And anyway, I'll be waiting a little bit for our friends that normally join us on Zoom to log in. I don't have anybody joining us yet. I will say that if we don't get people for conversation that join us, then I'll just read through and teach a shorter lesson. Ever since COVID first started, it's been a challenge to preach into what used to be preach into an empty building. That was a big challenge. I grew adjusted to that, but I haven't yet adjusted to doing Bible study with just those of you who are watching online. So let's see what happens. It's just now 7 o'clock, and I'll invite you just to sit in silence and wait with me if you've already listened in, and we'll wait for the others to come and to join us, and then we'll start reading, and I'll be discussing with you and try to anticipate your questions and your comments. Oh, I forgot to tell you, if you want to read along with what we're going to be reading tonight, we are in this study, we are in the middle of the book of Esther. Esther is about 1/3 of the way through the Bible, still in the Hebrew Scriptures. Esther is a beautiful story. It's a story complete in and of itself. And, if there are parts of the Bible that you have trouble reading, it doesn't make sense to you, read the book of Esther. It's powerful. It's powerful about the way the world is, about how broken things can be, especially if you've ever lived, and I never have, lived in an occupied country. Esther and her friend Mordecai are captives. They were taken when the Babylonians conquered the Israelites and deported all of the natives and spread them out all over the known world to them. And in this case, time has elapsed, and now the Persians are the occupying country. They're the occupying rulers of the area, and they determine the lives for the Israelites, who are seen as almost like slaves, but definitely not full citizens, and just they're a kept people, and they live under an occupied rule. They have no say for themselves. I'm still waiting to see if anyone's going to join us on the Zoom. Sometimes people arrive a little later. I could think that they're arriving later because of the snow, except that the cool thing about Zoom is you don't have to drive. So we'll see what's happening to our regular attenders and listeners here as time unfolds. It's now just about 5 minutes after 7, so we'll wait a little longer and see who's going to come and join us. Oh, here comes one person. Here comes Barbara.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Deb is not joining us tonight. She's in New Hampshire.
Oh,
In the
okay.
snow.
Well, you're the only one so far.
Good.
So may just be you and me for a little bit.
Okay, not a problem.
No. All right,
Yeah.
I just have to turn the volume down a little bit on the Zoom in the room.
So how much snow did you get?
I think we got 5 inches.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I don't know for sure, but it seemed to disappear pretty quick on the roads.
Oh, good.
All the schools closed, but I think mostly that was because they were dying for a snow day.
Exactly.
Everybody wanted a day off. So that worked out all
Okay.
right. And our
That's
school
true.
closed, so I didn't mind that either.
No.
So how was the weather down there?
80s.
Man. Yeah, that's why everybody's headed to Florida right now.
Okay.
My
where
daughter and
am
her
I?
husband are driving down this week.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they just decided they wanted an adventure. So they put their newborn baby and their dog in the car and packed up stuff, and they're down below North Carolina now. They're going to drive.
Oh, jeez. More power to them.
I know, that's what I say. I used to think that was an adventure. I don't think of that as an adventure anymore.
Oh, jeez. Let's see. I've lost, it sounds like something, I've lost, oh, there it is, Esther.
Esther, yeah, Esther, and I think we're in chapter 5. I think that's what we're up to.
Yeah. I'm looking at what we did last time. Let's see.
I think last time was just when Mordecai, yeah, who is it? Haman.
I have 3, 4, 5, so I'm not sure if we did 5. You don't think we did it?
I don't think so, because 5 is when Esther actually presents herself to the king. And all we got was
okay.
Mordecai pleading with her to go and make the thing. I think the last thing we read was that they were all going to pray for them. They were all going to pray. As Esther was going to go into the king, everybody was going to pray that she would have a favorable audience. And that was at the end
That's
of
what I
chapter.
remember.
Yeah.
Hello.
Oh,
Ah,
who else is with
here
us
we
now?
go.
Melinda.
Hello, Melinda.
Hello, Lou. Hello.
Right. We
No,
don't see
I'm
picture.
actually working from home today,
Oh, okay.
but I'm
Oh,
on my work computer. And because I work on 2 screens, my laptop is down because if I open it, then I see the same thing on 3 screens.
Oh, okay. Yeah,
I'm
no.
you don't want to be on 3 screens, do you?
I'm not technically savvy to know how to make it 3 different screens. I can only make it to 2 screens.
Oh my God. That's more than enough for me. That's for sure.
I always feel like I'm in a race and I'm behind in the race when it comes to technology. So I never.
I like to say, set me up and give me the tools,
Yeah,
I'll use
that's
them.
right.
Don't ask for me.
That's
Don't ask
right.
me to do more than
Don't
that.
ask me to do more than that.
And Cheryl is coming?
Hi,
Hi,
Cheryl.
Cheryl.
Good evening, everyone.
I gotta move
Good
it.
evening. You sound a little low.
I sound what?
A little low.
Oh, let me turn the volume up.
Could be me. So
There we go. Now I can see you all better. Just had to move you in closer.
it's not you, Cheryl. It's me. I have my volume all the way down to 10. Let me put it up to like 24. Okay. So
Well,
it
we
was
can
me.
hear you. Okay, can you hear us now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, good. All right. Well, welcome, Cheryl. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing okay too. I had a nice kind of half a day of rest with the snow, so that was good. All the school was closed, and so I like snow for that reason only. The rest of it I could do without it. I could just do with all the rest of it. You know, a couple of times today I was walking on newly shoveled or plowed roads, and I'm aware that, I'm getting older, and I'm aware that my risk is I don't want to fall down and break a bone, you know? It's like,
Yeah,
I never
you
worried
don't
about that.
either.
You don't worry about that when you're young, you know?
No,
But all of a
no.
sudden, I'm very aware to be very careful about my footing. So
Mhm.
I guess that means I'm getting older. I hope it means I'm getting wiser.
I think it's a nice compromise,
Yeah,
combination of the two.
yeah, I hope so. All right, well, why don't we get started? We are reading in Esther, and we have completed Esther chapter 4. I'm just going to do a quick reminder of the drama. Esther is the chosen queen of Ahasuerus the king, and this is in the time of the captivity of Persia. Esther is a fictional story. It is made up from the times and the places and the characters that would have been part of the culture in Babylon and some of the challenges of living in an occupied land. I've never lived in a country that's occupied by a hostile government, but Esther lays out that reality and asks the question, always indirectly, how are we to live? You know, the Israelites were used to saying that, you know, the God of Israel was their God, and they had a temple, and they had a land, and they were in charge of their lives. They're not in charge of their lives now. And the question then becomes, how do they remain faithful to God, especially if the laws of the land contradict their own conscience? And so has become the queen. She's favored by the king, but Haman, who is the right hand of the king, is determined to assassinate and annihilate all the Jews because he did not like that Mordecai, who is a Jew, refused to bow down and grovel in the dirt to show homage to him. So we are picking it up right at the point where Mordecai hears of the plan for great assassination. All the Jewish people are to be assassinated on one day in every city throughout the land. And Mordecai has gone to Esther the queen and said,
I don't.
I think you need to go into the king. I think you need to go in.
I was
And
going to say, do you want to
How's that bothering you?
you need to go in and you need to plead with the king to save the lives of your country people. In order to do so, she risks her life. Because if you approach the king in his chambers without being invited, it's punishable by death. So it's a very quick summary. The story is much better than I've told it, but I think you'll see the joy of the story picks right up, and so we can begin with verse 5 or chapter 5 and read on in the story from there. Who would like to read? Barbara, you want to read?
Sure, why not?
Okay.
On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace opposite the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne inside the palace opposite the entrance to the palace. As soon as the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favor, and he held out to her the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the top of the scepter. The king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Then Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a banquet that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther desires." So the king and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. While they were drinking wine, the king said to Esther, "What is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther said, "This is my petition and request. If I have won the king's favor, and if it please the king to grant my petition and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet that I will prepare for them, and then I will do as the king has said." Haman went out that day happy and in good spirits. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, and observed that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was infuriated with Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Then he sent and called for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the ministers of the king. Haman added, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but myself come with the king to the banquet that she prepared. Tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this does me no good so long as I see the Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and those friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on it. Then go with the king to the banquet in good spirits." This advice pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made.
I think it would be good just to keep reading because I don't want to interrupt right in the middle of this part of the movement of the story.
And so on that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals, and they were read to the king. It was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had conspired to assassinate King Ahasuerus. Then the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" The king's servants who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he prepared for him. So the king's servants told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." The king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor?" Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king wish to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king wishes to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and a horse that the king has ridden, with a royal crown on its head. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let him robe the man whom the king wishes to honor, and let him conduct the man on horseback through the open square of the city, proclaiming before him, 'Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor.'" Then the king said to Haman, "Quickly take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to the Jew Mordecai, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse and robed Mordecai and led him riding through the open square of the city, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king wishes to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, for whom your downfall has begun, is of Jewish people, You will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him." While they were still talking to him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the banquet that Esther had prepared. Continue?
No, I think we can stop. Maybe we can chat a little bit about this because it's pretty good drama. Don't you agree? I mean,
Mhm.
it's
The plot thickens.
the plot is thick. Oh my goodness, poor Haman,
Wow.
right? The very thing he plots against Mordecai, now in his own arrogance, thinking the king is asking to honor him, he has to honor Mordecai with the best honors he could think of, and it just about kills him. I want to pause and say, we talked about this last week a little bit. The theology of Esther, meaning the image of how God works and what God does in the book of Esther, is never named as the work of God. You don't see God named here anywhere. But in your understanding of the great stories of the Bible, of Joseph and his jealous brothers who sold him into slavery, and that resulted in him becoming in charge of all the food in the famine, all of the kind of synergy, I want to call it, the way things work in the world, God, the theology of this part of the Bible is that God takes the evil plans, the brokenness, the hatred that exists in the world and transforms it. I don't know what other word to use. God transforms it. And I said this last week, personally, and I'll name it as a personal preference, this is a way of describing how God works in the world that I prefer, rather than seeing God making a big master plan, like somehow God put it in the heart of Haman to plot against Mordecai so that God's purposes could be accomplished. My view is that a better and stronger theology, a thread that runs throughout the Bible, is that the world's broken. It is broken. There is hatred. There's warfare. There's all these things in the world that exist that I can say to you, and I think in our most clear moments we acknowledge these things are not things that God wants. It's not God doing these things in the world. I think if you start to say that, then you make God responsible for the evil. And I think that question is not answered in the Bible. Why is there evil in the world? Where did it come from? It's not answered, but it is very clearly described that it exists. Jealousy and hatred and all the things that destroy the values of the reign of God, they exist in the world. And if you want to see the question is not why is it there, but what does God do about it? And that's more the question of the theology that is so clear in the book of Esther. What God does is, that great phrase that Joseph said to his brothers after it was revealed that and they were all in Egypt. What you have done for evil, God has taken and used it, has transformed it to accomplish good in the world for God's purposes. It's not God doing it, not bringing the evil, but that God is, and I'll go to our own Christian faith, God did not make the mobs cry out for Jesus' death. God did not make them do that. But when the crowd lost its mind and screamed for Jesus to be crucified, the power of God is seen that even on the worst days, in the worst planned evil and painful demonstration of our human hardness of our hearts, God transforms that. God transforms the crucifixion of Jesus into the power and the might of the resurrection. And that, to me, as if you listen to me and I'm teaching a class or preaching a sermon, you're always going to hear that that's my go-to way of explaining what I think is the biblical view of how God works in the world. It contradicts a little bit of sort of Middle Ages theology that makes God all-powerful and that nothing happens that God doesn't ordain, and that everything that happens somehow in a plan of God. You're not going to hear a lot of that kind of talk from me as a pastor. What you will hear from me is that no matter what happens in the world, God's power is manifest when what is done for evil, what is perpetrated in evil, God transforms into love and grace and beauty, and that's where you see the power of God. Hello, Colette.
Hello, sorry. Someone at my church fell. A woman fell and broke bones in her face,
Oh,
her
dear.
elbow, her hip,
Oh,
and her leg.
Oh my God.
And we were just, we were trying to get a prayer group for
Oh.
her.
My.
So, my goodness.
that's horrible. That is horrible. Well, I was just talking about,
Horrible.
earlier, I was just about 10 minutes ago, I was talking about how I'm aware that what snow means for me now is I get worried I'm going to slip and fall and break a bone. I just said that. And so now here you are telling us that indeed it does happen, and it's terrible when it does. It's terrible.
Yeah.
So, but welcome. I'm glad you're here. Judy, welcome to you as
Yes,
well.
hello, thank you. Sorry I'm late. A little
That's okay.
slow in the surgery.
Everybody was kind of late today. How are you doing in your recovery?
Very slow, like a snail, but it is going in the right direction.
Okay, that's good.
I guess.
That's good.
I keep being told it is. Right. Very incremental.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, sometimes sometimes you can't see a snail move, but he is.
That's exactly right.
So a good metaphor.
Good to be here. See everybody. Yeah.
So we just finished reading chapter 5 and chapter 6 in Esther. And in this part of the story, this huge, it's beautiful writing. It's just absolutely beautiful writing. Haman is plotting a terrible death for Mordecai. He wants to see him hanged in the city gate. His wife convinces him to build the gallows and have it all ready. Meanwhile, he thinks he's being honored because he's been invited to a dinner with Esther and the king, and he thinks he is rising to the top. And while he's rising to the top, he is not going to tolerate anything of Mordecai's defiance. Only the king has a dream. And in the Hebrew stories, the kings dream dreams, and out of the dreams comes things that are part of God's working of power in our lives. I've been a long believer that if you're stuck and you really don't know what's happening and you need to grow some in your faith, you ought to, before you go to bed at night, say a prayer and ask to dream a dream. And when you ask to dream a dream, put a tablet next to your nightstand and put a pencil on it. And when you do, you can invite a dream to come. And you can invite a dream into the frontal consciousness of your brain. And then when you wake up, as soon as you wake up, you take the pencil and you write the dream down. And then you'll spend the rest of the 3 days or 4 days trying to figure out what it means. But
Yeah.
so, and that's a big part, too, of the whole, how does God speak to us? Throughout the Bible, you could turn to story after story after story, and you can see that God works through our subconscious, works through our dreams. And especially if you have a dream and it is difficult to interpret or to understand, you build community around it by telling someone else about what your dream is and asking them to help you to figure out what it might mean. It can be a really fun adventure, just really something exciting to do. And sometimes you do it and then you dream a dream that scares you to death. But that's okay. That's all right. It's still just a dream. And it still becomes important information. I don't know if it's necessarily information from God, but I always think of it as a divine kind of message about your life and about who you are. And I really believe in that. So it's worked very well for me over the years, too.
And there were people who
That interpretation.
reads. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Wait, you both
No.
talked at the same time, so I didn't hear it.
I'm wondering if you've read Freud's interpretation of dreams.
Yes. Yes, I think you have to be careful.
Okay. I've never read it, but I was just curious.
In seminary, I took a course from a psychologist, and this is not like, it's not like extraterrestrial or whatever, but psychology does have some common interpreters of dreams. So like if you dream a dream, then the dream is taking place in the second story of a house. So this is the kind of clues they give you. If the dream is upstairs in a house, it means that there's a problem in your thinking, that you're trying to resolve a problem about how you're thinking. If the dream takes place in the main floor of the house, they say that means that you're working on relationships, and that what happens in the dream has to do with encouraging you to think about certain relationships that you'll understand when you have the dream. If the dream takes place in the basement, it's trying to help you to be revealed about not something you're thinking about, but something you're worrying about. It's trying to flesh out your worries. And there's images and metaphors in there for that. Now that's as far as I'm going to go with the education about that. But so the king, Ahasuerus, goes to sleep, and he is troubled. He's having trouble sleeping. And it occurs to him to get the record of his life as a king, and he wants to see who are the people who have been honored in his kingdom. And he remembers that this guy Mordecai saved his life. And he checks the record to see if he ever did anything to thank him. Now, in the theology of the Hebrews, Mordecai, or Ahasuerus, King Ahasuerus, being disturbed and looking into this book would be seen as the nudging from God. He's nudging. God is shaping this story in response to the growing threat of Haman. Haman is devising terrible plans, mass murder of people. And God is at work turning those plans into something good. And it's a very walk alongside us kind of theology.
Who's Haman?
Haman is the king's right-hand man. He's Ahasuerus' right-hand man who hates Mordecai. And he's the one that last week, remember, convinced the king that Jewish people were horrible malcontents in his kingdom and they should all be murdered because Mordecai would not bow down and honor Ahasuerus. And Ahasuerus didn't know what he was up to, and he thought, well, that's right. I mean, people should, they should give allegiance to their king. They should have to, show allegiance. And if they don't, they should be killed. So that's who Haman is. He's the bad guy of the bad guys at the present time. Any comments? What are you thinking?
I was thinking about dreams. Uh-huh.
I was thinking that this is a weird turn of events.
This is This is a very weird turn of events.
Yeah.
Be careful. I would say the moral of this, if there's one, there's probably many more. Be careful the evil you plan for other people. You know,
Yeah, the word people, what am I thinking of? Cabalistic, where people, just murdering each other, and in so many of the stories, how they, there's so much violence against each other,
yes.
and division, divisiveness, and, so it goes so far back.
Yes.
Yeah. And in each of these stories, and so many of these stories, we find that, that somebody rises to the top, a leader rises to the top, and then turns on his own people. And yeah, and
It's especially disturbing when people who do become powerful and rise to the top then give God the credit for their rise in power, and then also claim that it's God who tells them that all these other people have to be killed.
yeah, cannibalistic. That was what the word
I mean,
was.
it's a murderous instinct in the human heart.
Yeah, yeah.
And everybody
Yeah.
always wants to attribute it to God. And people say, oh, I can't read the Old Testament because God in the Old Testament is so violent. And I go, well, it's not God that's violent. It's people and their assignment of their hatred to other people. And then their absolute firm belief that God is the author of all those feelings. Just they don't blame it on the devil, they blame it on God. All right, well, why don't we read on? This story hangs together, and no point in waiting for next week. Let's see what happens next.
Okay. On that night, the king could not sleep, and he gave orders to bring the book of records, the annals, and they were read to the king. Was found written. Am I reading the same thing I just read?
Yeah, you
Yes.
just did that one.
Sorry about that.
That's all right.
Okay, I lost track. So we're at 7 then.
Yes, 7.
So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. On the second day, as they were drinking wine, the king again said to Esther, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have won your favor, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me. That is my petition, and the lives of my people, that is my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we have been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have held my peace, but no enemy can compensate for this damage to the king." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has presumed to do this?" Esther said, "A foe and enemy, this wicked Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king rose from the feast in wrath and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that the king has determined to destroy him. When the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman, good, H will come. Haman had thrown himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, and the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. And Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance, the king said, "Look, the very gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the anger of the king abated.
Yeah. Wow is right. Yeah, wow. Yes. This is, I think, again, the writer of this is trying to, with great literary skill, this is an amazing, amazing story. And it weaves in everything that was a part of their lives, everything a part of their lives in captivity. But it tells a story that somehow the right, somehow what should happen, somehow what needs to happen ultimately is going to happen. And just in the darkest part of the night, as they're all about to be assassinated, Haman is revealed. And the king, it's not even just enough that the king now knows what Haman's plotted. It's that he falls on Queen Esther to beg her for his life. And the king thinks that he's trying to rape her. It just went, wow, did it go bad for him. Like, it couldn't have gotten any worse.
If there was any thought that if the king had any doubts in what he was about to do, he just made up his mind.
He did. He sealed the deal for himself. And then, of course, he gets hanged on a gallows he built for somebody else.
Wow.
Yeah.
Good. It's a movie.
It is a movie.
So is this all God's work?
Well,
God made us do it?
I wouldn't, you know me well enough to know I wouldn't say that.
I know.
But what
That's what I'm saying. That's what the reasoning behind everyone said, well, God wanted me to do this.
Right. I think that instead, I go back to those words from last week, that if you watch and see how life unfolds, that the arc of history is toward justice. That's the kind of thing I think is going on here. That's why God is not named in this. It doesn't say anywhere in here that God saw to it that Haman was hanged on his own gallows. I think that what you're supposed to be doing is you're supposed to be seeing how the author has revealed for us that justice and love are at work in the world. They are happening. And sometimes you can only see them. You can only really almost see behind the scenes in the worst moments, right at the pinnacle of the time when Haman is about to execute all these people, and he thinks he's lost in his own joy and his pride about himself. In that moment, if you look carefully, you can see something else about life is unfolding. That's the way I want to say it. I don't want to say, oh, well, now here, God caused Haman to build a gallows, and then I don't think it's there like that. I don't think the agency of God is described in Esther like that. I think the agency of God happens in the book of Esther the same way the agency of God happens in our lives. And evil and destructive plans, I'm not saying it happens immediately. God knows there are people who plan evil for people, and they are killed and they're murdered and they're maimed. It happens. Life is full of tragedy and horror. But if you look into it and you keep your eyes of faith open, you will see that another plan is at work, that God is working out of the evil plans of Haman, out of the broken heart of Haman and his evil designs. God is taking what Haman meant for evil, and it is being transformed. It's dramatically transformed when Haman is hung on his own gallows. But you don't often see it quite like that. It never becomes quite that plain. But in this text, I think that we're being taught what the Hebrew people were taught in terms of how am I to understand that this is God's world with all the brokenness and the hatred and the desires for the death of people that we don't like. How am I to understand that this is God's world? God is at work in the evil plans of others, transforming it into moments of good and of justice and of grace, but you have to look for it. You have to believe it's there. And
But is justice when someone else is hanged? Is that justice?
I don't think so. I don't think the story necessarily, I mean, those of us who are reading it are relieved that Haman is hanged, right? And
Right.
we all think, well, he got exactly what he deserved. But the story does not say that God cheered when Haman was dead. What you see is, I think that what they're trying to accomplish is the plans of evil people will sometimes fall on their own heads.
Mm-hmm.
And that if the gallows weren't there, Haman wouldn't be hung. Why are the gallows there? The gallows are there because of Haman's hatred towards Mordecai.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than sort of moving out to see God, the agency of God somehow working involved and saying, well, look at there, God saw to it that Haman got hanged. I think the evil that Haman planned came to its rightful fruition. I wish I could quote some really great sayings now about how evil plans turn into evil things for yourself. I don't know. I can't think of any right now, but that's what I would do if I could think of them. And again, you can read and you can teach the story of Esther, and you do not have to resort to what I call the classical way of describing God at work in our lives. From the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, we've been taught to extract from life the question and to say, well, look, now see, God caused Haman to be jealous or allowed that to happen, and then God saw to it that Haman was hung on his own gallows. I think we can let evil have its due. Evil is powerful. Hatred is powerful. Jealousy and the longing for power, like the text from Sunday of Jesus in the wilderness. Those temptations that were presented to Jesus, they have power in the world. And that power, if you give into that power and you go with that power, it has its own, what I want to say, reward. It has its own consequences that come with it. But I don't think we have to resort to, again, the idea of God somehow mechanically controlling everything that happens in the world. I just don't think that's true. There's a lot that is taking place in the world just this night, right now, that God is not happy it's happening. God is not in favor that it's happening. And God is certainly not part of the plan that it's happening. The world is broken. It's full of brokenness. But the power of God, even throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, the God of the Bible is the God who encounters the brokenness of the world, and I don't know. My language is failing me. Transforms it. I want to say this. I want to say this word, although it doesn't seem to fit. God resurrects. God resurrects the evil that happens in the world, and that's on purpose takes us to the death of Jesus on the cross. God resurrects the painful, hurtful, horrible things that human beings do, resurrects them, and presents us instead with life. And when I sing, "All hail the mighty power of God," that's the power of God that I look for in the world. I don't see the power of God as somehow being the master in the machine and controlling everything that happens in the world. I just don't believe that. I think that gets you into a really unfortunate way of thinking about why bad things happen in the world. They happen. You got to start with that reality. They happen. Bad things happen. Good friends fall on the ice and smash their face, and terrible things happen. And we hear about them, and we cringe because we know this is what life is like. But we do not give in to the temptation of saying, okay, well, why did God allow that to happen to her? We don't do that. I don't think we do that when we want to be biblical Christians. I think instead, we pray that God's power will be made clear, that when our friends trip on the sidewalk and break bones, that in every part of that experience, the power of love and the resurrecting power of God will be at work in that person's life. And that'll be an opportunity for love to be seen, for care and compassion to be demonstrated, and that God releases the power of resurrection in the face of sometimes just fateful accidents, and especially in the face of planned, horrible events that human beings do to each other. What do you think about that?
It's very dismal. Really.
Well,
Thinking about
yeah, go ahead.
today and reflecting, what's going on today. There are pieces here that we could just take up and glue on to everyday scenes.
Yes.
How it's governed and how people are treating each other and countries being destroyed. And yeah. So what have we learned? What is the learning of all of this?
Well, I think, I know it might be too simple, but, when I think about the situation of Vladimir Putin and his enormous need to control Ukraine and his willingness to sacrifice thousands of lives, his own soldiers, men, women, and children, destroying homes. In the conventions of war, there's nothing really worse than attacking a residential home. But he doesn't care about that. It's like, he's like Haman. He wants to see people annihilated. And that is real. It's happening. It's taking place. But also, I believe this with all my heart. Somebody said, I think in the New York Times today had an article that said that Vladimir Putin has changed the face of the world forever. Because never before has there been such an alliance of human care and compassion that is taking place in response to the circumstances that are happening in Ukraine. It's global. People from all over the world, and it extends to Turkey and to Syria. There's situations there where people are perceived somehow as enemies of each other. But in the face of disaster, what's happening? There's sharing of goods. There's searching together for water. There's binding of wounds. There's all of this display, this amazing display of things that warm your heart. They don't undo the brokenness of the world. They don't. But they take the brokenness of the world at its face as a fact. And then they respond. They respond. And they respond not with evil for evil, but they respond with grace and love and sharing, and nations offering hospitality to other nations, letting down their border controls, families opening their homes to other families. These, throughout the Hebrew Scripture, these are the signs of God. Hospitality is the earmark of the God of the Bible. And in the New Testament, even with the community of Jesus, Paul says, or Jesus says, look, if you go into a village and they don't welcome you, get out. because the Spirit of God is not present there. You know, if hospitality is not exercised, then God is not there. Because the overwhelming sign of God's presence in the world is to offer hospitality in a world that is cold and full of greed and envy and all these things. In the face of all that, hospitality is the undoer of all that brokenness. And it defies it all. So when you're depressed or when you see the terrible things of the world, you get up and you go do something powerfully kind and wonderful for somebody else.
Yeah.
And especially something that might it be costly to you, something that maybe even risks a little bit of your comfort. All of that, if you put all of that into the soup of the world, God making this big soup, there's some bitter things in the soup of life. But there are also some powerfully wonderful herbs that can overcome the power of evil and jealousy and megalomania and everything else. And they're simple. Hospitality and generosity. People are in terrible, terrible car wrecks, and terrible things happen. And then, one of the neighborhood ladies will come out and take somebody that's been damaged in the wreck and take them in and sit them down at her kitchen table and give them a bowl of soup. And it doesn't change what's happened, but it changes everything.
Mm-hmm. You had mentioned the ark, and I'm just looking at the Martin Luther King quote, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice."
Right.
And I just been reading Susan Rice's autobiography, and I didn't realize that in the Oval Office during Obama's reign or administration, he had that as part of the carpet in the Oval Office. Had that quote in it.
And I think, to me, one of the most important words in that phrase is long. Because, boy, history can sure seem like the brokenness has a long, long day. A long day. And if it's bending, it's almost imperceivable that it's bending towards morality and good things. But it is. Like our friend Colette or Judy talking about the snail. The moral universe moves like a snail. and the question usually becomes, do you perceive it? Do you perceive it? Are your eyes clouded with the tears of the brokenness and the injustice that takes place? Or can you perceive the incremental movements that are happening of God in the world, and then let your life be applied to the application of the most beautiful gifts of life, of love and compassion, and of overcoming your fears, and all those things that again go to the accounts of the biblical stories. Your goodness, your kindness, your mercy today, this afternoon, tonight, has the power to transform the evil and the hatred and the injustice and the prejudice that has gone on for years before. It has that power because that's how God works. I saw somewhere a quote today, it might have been in one of those things that Barbara sent me, I'm not sure, that Christianity is not so much a faith as it is an action. Christianity is an action. It's an action in a world that is filled with the opposites of God, with the defiers of God. And what are the actions that release the power of the moral universe? Kindness. It's underrated. Kindness is underrated in its ability to transform the world.
Sometimes the snail doesn't see the movement itself, but other people do.
Right.
It's interesting. I'm listening to you.
Well,
Yeah.
especially, I think, especially if you're the one that is suffering as a victim of the brokenness. It is, it's too much to ask for a person who is being unjustly treated, for a battered spouse, for example, to say to her, oh, don't you see, the moral universe is unfolding. There are people that need to be rescued. They need the active involvement of the God who came and heard the cries of the Israelites and delivered them from their captivity. There is also that. So I don't think you can just simply say to somebody who's being beaten, or someone who's sitting in jail unjustly accused, falsely accused of a crime they didn't commit, and then offer the salve to that wound to say, oh, well, God's transforming everything. Hold on, be patient. I think that's a little bit much. They might say that themselves, but I think that's a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes the acts of kindness or of hospitality or of mercy are small, but sometimes they have to be big. Sometimes they have to be big, and sometimes they have to be the result of organization, of a community, or of people to stand up against institutionalized hatred and injustice. It doesn't only always have to be small. Sometimes we can cooperate together and make big things. We can make big responses of the cry for justice. Nothing makes the blood course through my veins more than a massive march of people who are determined to declare that whatever's happened is no more. We're not going to have it anymore. And we join together with each other to make our plea for compassion or call for action, something that is more than just one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about Iran and those women who are so brave, marching without their hijabs, defiance of authority, where they know that one of these other women, was tortured and murdered for the same thing. Yeah, but they're out there, they're marching.
Yeah, and that's, I forgot, as I mentioned, that list of things that I think are marks of God's work, solidarity, right? That came out of the movements for liberation theology in Central and South America. Solidarity, standing with others who are suffering. And the refusal to pretend that what happens to my sister doesn't matter.
And being silent.
Yeah. And you think, well, what difference does it make, if you just are saying or you're chanting? If it didn't make any difference, why do they work so hard to silence it?
Right.
Why do they work so hard to see to it that a unified voice is not raised?
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And it looks as though there's some incremental change, because they're not firing on these women yet.
Right.
Who knows what will happen, but at the moment. And then I guess you could say maybe that's God interceding. I don't know. But there has been some small change. Yeah.
And I keep saying it, that the brokenness of the world is severe. It's not just a little bit. The world is life on this planet is a very brutal and trying experience. Maybe not for me today, but you don't have to look around very far. And you can talk about political abuse and power, but then look at the struggles we have with our illness, with our health. The diseases that attack us.
Right.
And you can get pretty depressed if you just look around and you just see all the circumstances of brokenness that there are in the world. But I think that the eyes of the believer, the eyes of the person of faith, are turned toward the power of God. And what does the power of God mean? The power of God means the power that is in my hands and my voice in my life to be able to bear witness to the marks and the signs of the kingdom, which are kindness and compassion and courage and the moral universe, the things that we know will sustain life instead of exterminating it.
Yeah.
Happened to me.
All right, let's read another chapter, Barbara.
Yeah. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. Then the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. So Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet, weeping and pleading with him to avert the evil design of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. The king held out the golden scepter to Esther, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, "If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and if I have his approval, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote, giving orders to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to the Jew Mordecai, "See, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he plotted to lay hands on the Jews. You may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." The king's secretaries were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day, and an edict was written according to all the Mordecai commanded to the Jews and to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. He wrote letters in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers riding on fast steeds bred from the royal herd. By these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them with their children and women, and to plunder their goods on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree in every province and published to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift royal steeds, hurried out, urged by the king's command. The decree was issued in the citadel of Susa. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king, wearing royal robes of blue and white, with the great golden crown and a mantle of the linen and purple, while the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was light and gladness, joy and honor. In every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict came, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a festival and a holiday. Furthermore, many of the peoples of the country professed to the Jews because the fear of the Jews had fallen upon them.
Okay, what do you say about that?
So far, the Jews aren't doing bad things to others.
Yeah, right, they're not. They're absolutely not. And I think one of the commentary footnotes says that the problem here is the king has already given an edict like this with the seal of his ring, and that is that all these people are to be killed. And with that, the thing is, a king cannot take back that command. So the command that went out could not say, don't harm these people, because that would be undoing that. So instead, they devised the edict that said, well, you should be prepared that if you try to do this, that the Jewish people are going to defend themselves. And they're going to be taking up arms, and they're going to do so with the blessing of the king. So you better cool your jets, I guess is what I think they're basically saying. That, you do not have the right to just commit genocide against this people and have the blessing of the king and of the king's army and soldiers. And then it's interesting that the last sentence says that because of this, many, many people in the cities are professing to be Jews when they're not. They're like, well, no, I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish. Sure, I'm Jewish.
Don't hurt me.
Yeah, because they feared that now this people that were oppressed were going to rise up and become the terrorizing people.
It's like, what's his name?
Life is funny. It's very funny. Well, why don't we read on? We're still silence. We haven't motivated you all to jump in with questions or comments, so.
Now on the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, when the king's command and edict were about to be executed, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, but which had been changed to a day when the Jews would gain power over their foes. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who had sought their ruin. And no one could withstand them, because the fear of them had fallen upon all peoples. All the officials of the provinces, the satraps and the governors and the royal officials were supported the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai had fallen upon them. For Mordecai was powerful in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, as the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. So the Jews,
Yeah, here we go.
So they struck down all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering and
Oh,
Yeah.
did they pleased to those who hated them. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 people. They killed Dalphon, Aspatha, Paratha, Adalia, Arijatha, Parmashit, Arisai, Ardai, Vaseth, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they did not touch the plunder. That very day, the number of those killed in the citadel of Susa was reported to the king. The king said to Queen Esther, in the citadel of Susa, the Jews have killed 500 people, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your petition? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. Esther said, If it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. The Jews who were in Susa gathered also on the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 persons in Susa, but they did not touch the plunder. Now the other Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives and gained relief from their enemies and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that day a feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the open towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, a holiday on which they send gifts of food to one another. Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, enjoining them that they should keep the 14th day of the month Adar, and also the 15th day of the same month, year by year, as the days on which the Jews gained relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make the days of feasting and gladness days for sending gifts of food to one another and presents to the poor. So the Jews adopted as a custom what they had begun to do, as Mordecai had written to them. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of all Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast her, that is, the lot, to crush and destroy them. And when Esther came before the king, he gave orders in writing that the wicked plot that he had devised against the Jews should come upon his own head, and that he and his son should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, these days are called Purim, the word Pur. Thus, because of all that was written in the letter, and of what they had faced in the matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews established and accepted as a custom for themselves and their descendants, and all who joined them, that without fail they would continue to observe these 2 days every year, as it was written and at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every family, throughout every generation, in every family, province, and city. And these days of Purim should never fail to disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, along with the Jew Mordecai, gave full written authority confirming the second letter about Purim. Letters were sent wishing peace and security to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, and giving orders that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as the Jew Mordecai and Queen Esther enjoined on the Jews, just as they had laid down for themselves and for their descendants regularly concerning their fates, fasts, and their lamentations. The command of Queen Esther fixed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Shall I finish the last?
Yeah, I think you might as well. Go ahead.
King Ahasuerus laid tribute on the land and on the islands of the sea. All the acts of his power and might, and the full account on the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him. Are they not written in the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was powerful among the Jews and popular with his many kindred, for he sought the good of his people and interceded for the welfare of all his descendants.
Okay, well, there's certainly a troubling middle portion here, but I don't know whether the point of the story is that these many people had to be killed because they hated Jews. I don't know, but they certainly did kill a lot of people.
Oh my.
Well, yeah, oh my is right.
Genius.
Notice,
When I was reading this, I was thinking, what would the Jews in Germany and in Europe have done if they had the ability when they were freed? Would they have gone on a rampage and killed the non-Jews in all the countries that had put them in concentration camps?
yeah. Well, listen, I would imagine there would have been some slaughter in that, and I also think some of what's being described here may be what we see and hear about the people of Ukraine. I mean, these people in Ukraine are being given the power to defend themselves. And as they're given the power to defend themselves, they are going and killing people.
Russians.
You know, and it's interesting that each pause of the narration, there's this phrase, they did not take the plunder. In other words, they were not mercenaries, you know, going in and taking the goods of these people in their homes and gathering up booty from the war. They were, the permission that was given to the Jews by Mordecai was the permission to defend themselves. That's what it says. It says that his edict that was sealed and sent everywhere was an announcement that the Jewish people were given permission to take up arms to defend themselves. And the narrator is making it very clear that the people who died are the people who hated Jews and who sought their destruction. So all this way down from in history as we stand and become spectators, I think we have to be careful that we don't pass judgment on people who were doing exactly what we would do if our families were at stake, or if in these towns and villages there were people who were known to be plotting to have carried out still the king's edict and to come into their houses and kill them all.
Well, it also brings up the question, is revenge justified?
Yeah. And I would say it even a little different in that way. Is this revenge? Is this revenge? Or
That's what I was thinking.
Or is this self-defense?
Or is it fear? Because they would not have been able to sleep, because although they were given permission to defend themselves, if the enemy came to them in the night, they would not be able to defend themselves.
Right. And they would be doing, the murdering would be taking place with the king's still blessing. The king had said, these people should all be killed. So they organized and were prepared, and when the day came, remember the history behind that word pure was that there was like a rolling of the dice, and whatever pure meant, that pure was the fateful day in which this mass execution was going to take place. That was on one day. From the rolling of the dice, there was a day that was set, and this extermination of all these people was going to be a massive bloodbath. And it was on the day of that side of the dice that was rolled of pure. And so when the prediction or the pathway of murder and annihilation and destruction did not happen, but instead kind of turned into a war of defense and a war of relief, putting an end to the threat. They begin a festival celebrating. Now stay with me. I'm not trying to ignore that people were killed, but a day when God again turned the plans of evil and hatred into a day of joy and relief for the people. And instead of the day of mourning, it becomes a holiday of celebration. You see what I'm saying? Here is again a repeat of the same rhythm of this theme which underlies this story. And that is that the plans that are made for evil and hurt and destruction are transformed into, like the same way that because it only happens to one man, we don't wince as much when Haman's plan for hanging Mordecai turns into Mordecai being hanged on his own gallows, right? Because this is a brutal man. But in some ways, the rest of this story is a telling of the same thing. The swords and the death that these people planned for the Jews, they fell on themselves. They ended up dead because of the plots they had against the Jewish people. And instead of a day of mourning for the Jews, the day has been transformed, not just that day, but as the end of the story goes on to tell, it institutionalized as a day of Thanksgiving, like we have Thanksgiving. They had feasts, and they drank wine, and they celebrated. And they lived out the irony that what was planned for their extermination became a holiday celebration of the continuation of their life.
So in a sense, the story really is history is a history of celebration and destruction, and celebration and destruction, or destruction and celebration. I mean, because it seems thematic.
Yes, yeah.
Wow.
Especially when you look at the story and how many plots of destruction and murder are transformed into a celebration of life and freedom and the resulting. It's cyclical, but it's.
Yeah, and I don't mean to interrupt, but I mean, and you read in the paper, it's exactly what's going on in the Ukraine.
Yes.
You know, destruction and the Russians, sending missiles and bombs, and then you read in the next, column, how one village has been spared and they are celebrating, and the children are wearing clothes that have been given to them. So it seems as though it's all that way through. Is just thematic.
Yeah, and I think, again, now I'll go back to my my sermon that I preached about this. This is a story, it's a text, it's a holy writ that is telling the story of God in the world. It is revealing the ways of God in the world. It acknowledges hatred, prejudice, it acknowledges jealousy, it acknowledges all those realities. But what it says is, hang on. Hang on. Hang in there. Because it never has the last word. The last word in each of these cycles, as Judy described them, the last word is always a day of celebration, a day of joy, a day of freedom, a day of awakening, of new opportunity. Look at the transformation just of Mordecai's life. Mordecai is a man who has no job. He's not known by anybody. He stands at the city gate. He's begging at the city gate. And the opportunity comes along. He overhears a plot to kill the king. And like Joseph back in Egypt, the opportunity comes. He whispers about the plot. He saves the king's life. And out of the evil plans that are being made, at one moment comes the unfolding of the most powerful plan, so that by the time you read the last chapter, Mordecai is the most powerful man in the world. It almost seems, even alludes to the fact that when King Ahasuerus dies, Mordecai might become the king.
I think about Zelensky as a TV comedian,
Yeah.
and nobody really paying much attention.
Yeah.
And here he's become, this very strong, dedicated, charismatic leader.
And
It was kind
I don't think there could be a better illustration of this theme that I'm trying to say as part of the biblical theme, how does God work in the world? God does not eliminate the terrible plots and plans that are devised in the hearts of evil human beings. And it doesn't always happen fast, but watch. Watch the snail. It moves, and it unfolds a deeper, abiding truth, a more powerful truth that cannot be undone. And
so
you go ahead.
So it stays inside its shell for a long time, but then
Yes.
when it's different.
Yeah.
Salvation when it comes out, and maybe destruction when it stays in. Yeah.
I think in a way the Apostle Paul is pointing to this in the New Testament when he describes that the followers of Jesus who witnessed the resurrection, who saw the worst day in human history come into fruition, and then saw God take that and transform it into the greatest day of human history. And then Paul goes on to say, therefore, we are knocked down, but we get back up. We are tortured every day, but we do not lose heart. And then at the end of it, he says, and we are killed, but we do not remain dead. And that is, he's trying to then infuse into the story of our lives this hope, this enduring hope of the presence of God and of God at work in the world, which, yes, is broken, which causes us to fall down or to be beaten down or to cry and to be overwhelmed, but we persist in the power of that movement that will yet come. And during the persecution of the Christians in the first century, the hope became life after death. You can kill us if you want to. Go ahead, kill us. And they did. They killed and maimed and murdered them. But on the institution of the resurrection, where Jesus witnessed that death is not ultimately the final word in this world. So the Christian community, they began to sing the songs and tell the stories of, look, take my body, torture my body, but you cannot take my life. It belongs to God. You can't. And that in the end, God will have the say. It will be God who will determine. And also then, just like in this story, the long-awaited hope of the great feast, of the joy, of the 23rd Psalm. You lead me, the Lord, my shepherd, I shall not want, leads me in paths of righteousness. He sets a table before me in the presence of my enemies. This is a very profound image of who God is. My enemies are marching down from the hills, and what does God do? God sets a table up and says, we ought to have a feast right here, right now. And it shows a defiance. It's a defiance of the power of evil and injustice and brokenness in the world. We will be joyful. We will be a joyful people. We will be a people who hold a feast. I know it's elementary and simple, but in The Grinch That Stole Christmas, the same theology is present. Take everything we have, take the Christmas tree and all the signs and symbols and the lights, and we will still sing the songs of Christmas. We will still sing the songs of joy and of hope. And even though there's no food for the feast, we will still have a feast. And I think that's again what did you call it? The cycle, Judy. It's the cycle of the message of every level. This is a masterful story because that cycle and that lesson is being taught at every level of the lives of these people. If you follow more, yeah, go ahead.
Must there always then be evil as part of the tapestry of history or life, or what if there I mean,
Well, I think that if I hear where you're going, again, there are certain things about how the history of human thought has developed, and that is, well, evil's necessary so that we can really see the good.
well,
And,
that's, yeah,
and I don't
right.
believe that. I don't think that's, well, listen, I don't think it's a matter of whether I believe it or not. I think that is not part of the Hebrews' understanding of the world. I think you have to stop a lot shorter of that kind of explanation. The Hebrew theology is, it happens. The brokenness happens. It's here. It's broke. There's separation. It exists. It's real. And because they weren't Greeks and because they weren't philosophers, they didn't ask why. They didn't ask why. Instead, they saw evil and the brokenness for what it was, and they got busy in their theology of addressing it.
Right. So they took action, like
They
you
took
said.
action. And I think that's why Christianity is the rightful heir of the Hebrew theology. It's, Jesus saying to the disciples in the day of his lifting up into heaven, and they said, when will the kingdom of God come? And Jesus says, none of your business. Get to work. The fields are ripe, the harvest is ready. Get out there and do the work that you're called to do as my people on the planet. So maybe that's a good time to end. We've come to our end of our time, and we've come to the end of Esther. Oh my goodness.
Job, oh my.
Oh,
I know. I'm telling you right now, we're not going to go into Job. Yeah. We're not going to do that. I mean,
Not tonight.
no, not at all.
not
We're
ever.
going to skip it.
I don't have the patience.
We're going to, listen, we could do the first 2 chapters if you want to, because there, the whole question of what does it mean that there's evil in the world, and you can see the startling theology that is a part of Job. And the whole idea that, God has a council of gods, and that one of them decides it would be really good to test a human being to see if, it holds up in faith. We could do that. We could read the first 2 chapters, but I'm not going any further than that.
Thank you.
Good. Thank you.
Have enough.
Right.
Have
Yeah,
enough.
and thank you for tonight.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you all. Good night,
Have a
everybody.
great week.
Right.
A good thing.
Great to have you here and to be together. Thank you.
Yes, right.
Good
All right.
night.
Good night.
Well,
Right.